put them on because it's very hard to hear. It sounds very garbly.
Okay.
Okay. And unlike the last one where everyone's jumping like this,
To be a little more alive, huh?
I want you.
I cannot do that.
Please interrupt, Franz. Like we did yesterday. Interrupt. This is a discussion. So actually, if you can move over here one. Let's see if we can bring this in a little bit.
Let's be into it.
Brett, you coming to dinner?
Let's do it in the
That's better. No, no, but it's okay.
most important.
We good?
Maybe
What's that one?
you should also bring yours.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, we want to see you. You should rock yourself.
Okay. Okay, does everybody have a microphone? Harley, do you have one?
I don't.
Fran? Okay. Does everybody have water that wants water?
Yeah, I have one.
Yes.
Okay, let's get it on. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we shall begin session 3. Okay, if we can have your attention, please. We're going to start session 3. And we're going to do this a little bit differently than session 2. What we're going to do is start by going around and introducing ourselves so you have an idea of who we all are. Once again, I'm Alan Abrahamson. I'm a sports writer from Los Angeles. I spent 17 years at the Los Angeles Times. I've been with NBC either online or on air since 2003. I am due to be columnist again for NBCOlympics.com in Tokyo. This is my 9th year teaching sports writing and journalism at the University of Southern California. Franz, over to you.
My name is Franz Schwarzenbacher. I'm a police officer since 33 years, so you can imagine how old I am. I have worked in many units before in drug cases, hard drug cases, in organized crime units, and so on and so on. And from 2008, I'm the head of the Integrity in Sports unit in the CIS in Vienna. We are based in the organized crime unit. Our first goal are not the athletes, to go against the athletes. Our goal are the people behind the athletes, the trainers, the doctors, the coaches, physios, and so on and so on. The phenomenon is very big. We have annual seizures, yearly seizures, more than 1 down of substances, of doping substances. We are responsible for the doping cases, the match-fixing cases, and the pharmaceutical cases. In 2018, we could...
All good. Go ahead.
In 2018, we could prove the selling from more than 28 tons of substances in or from Austria to the European Union. Our last cases was the IBU case, and the very last case, the Operation Adalas during the Nordic World Championship in Seefeld, Austria.
Brett?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. My name's Brett Clothier. I'm the head of the Athletics Integrity Unit. So we're the independent organisation that looks after all integrity issues for the sport of athletics. We were created by the Constitution of World Athletics, or the IAAF, as you remember them. The Constitution there sets out our remit, which is anti-doping and other code of conduct issues like anti-corruption as well. It sets out our functions, which are to investigate, prosecute cases, but also to educate athletes. The Constitution establishes an independent board to govern our operations and also guarantees our operational independence from the rest of the World Athletics organisation. So that's a little bit about us. I can provide more details later. Myself, I am Australian. I've been at the Athletics Integrity Unit for the last 2 and a bit years. Prior to that, I worked in sport integrity as the head of integrity for the Australian Football League, and I also worked in integrity in horse racing prior to that.
Yeah.
Good afternoon. My name is Yaya from Japanese Anti-Doping Agency. I know this is a short introduction, and I'm very bad at standing still or sitting down speaking, so apologizes. But I've been privileged to work for International Standard for Education as part of the WADA's Education Committee and the guidelines to coming in. So hopefully that you get a lot of attention to it. But I'm really happy that it's a fantastic opportunity to share a lot of visions into the future in this panel.
Arlie?
Hello, my name is Arlie Velasquez. I am from Mexico. I am 3 times Paralympian in winter sport, which is very, very rare for Mexico because I'm the only representative in alpine skiing. But I'm very, very happy to be part of this panel because I think it's very, very important to bring the perspective of the athlete in order to really take all the points of view in order to construct a better path in order to eradicate all the doping in sports.
Cynthia, and I love those shoes.
Well, thank you.
You are so welcome.
Hello, everyone. My name is Christine Mugera.
Dean, what am I thinking?
I forgive you. So, I work with Africa Zone 5 Regional Anti-Doping Organization, fondly named the RADO. So we are working with several countries in assisting them develop code-compliant anti-doping programs. So I'll be sharing more about our work as we go by. I'll give you my card so that you don't forget my name again.
Only once.
All right.
Peter.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Peter van Enu. I am a full professor at the Ghent University and the director of the Belgian WADA accredited laboratory. And I have been very fortunate insofar that I have been involved now in 23 years in anti-doping research. That's half of my life, and I hope to extend that with 23 years more, because once you get hooked on anti-doping research, you stay in that business. It is so interesting, and it is so beneficial to the sporting community that you would never want to stop with that.
Okay, so unlike the second panel, which was one by one, this one we hope will be interactive. We're very hopeful that there will be some dialogue, some back and forth. Some people will be interrupting, at least when we were going back and forth yesterday when we were talking to each other, there was a lot of interrupting. So here's to it, and here we go. Franz, the floor is yours. I pose this very simple question to you. What is your assessment of the system as it is today?
In my opinion, the system is not effectful enough. I will give you an example from the last case, the Operation Adalas. The German doctor started his business in 2011 up to 2019. He treated about more than 30 athletes with blood doping, autologous blood doping, sometimes twice a day. They got also EPO, growth hormones, and some other unknown substances. They were also using a new powder from science. The athletes collapsed after getting the powder. All those athletes were tested many times with urine and blood tests. All the tests were negative. So there must be a gap in the system. Why can't we find
To me, as a journalist, this poses a basic question. Is this a system that is working, or is it a system that is broken? You, as a law enforcement officer of many years with significant experience.
we need, especially behind the athletes, we need police work. And it's very important to get the law for it. In Austria, we are very lucky. We have the law, we have the anti-doping law, and also we have the penal code with sports fraud, with the possibility with imprisonment up to 10 years. So in Austria, we are very lucky, and we can go again against the bad guys behind the athletes, the doctors, the coaches, the managers, and so on. As I said, from police side, not the athletes are the first goal for us, the man behind the athletes are important.
Peter, you've heard Franz's description of this system. When you hear this description, what do you hear?
I especially feel a very negative impact in what he's saying, and I cannot fully agree with this. Yes, the system is not perfect. Having said that, looking back at Operation Aderla specifically, yes, none of the athletes had effectively tested positive, but many of them were being suspicious, called suspicious by blood passport values, by steroid passport values. They were under more stringent control. And going back 23 years when I started in the anti-doping world as a scientist, that was a system, to answer your question, which was broken. There were multiple substances which we could not detect at all. This is currently no longer the same. We can detect any substance, any method now, with our current techniques, even substances which are not yet on the market. Having said that, yes, there are still some loopholes. And science, and I'm very happy with the commitment of President Bach, but I think we need much more money. Science needs more money to make the next step and to make it better. But our situation from a scientific point of view is much better. And yes, there are loopholes, and now it's up to all of you present here today to fix some of those loopholes, to make sure that athletes, clean athletes are protected and that we close the last remaining loopholes. If you're looking at the doses athletes are using currently and the systems they are using, it shows you that with the new methods we have had a deterrent effect. They're using very low doses. They call it microdoses, but in effect, it are no longer microdoses. For those of you who are scientists, it is not a microdose, it is not a nanodose, it is a femtodose, which means that probably it has very little performance-enhancing effect, and, what is important to me, also the health risks are much less than it was certainly in the 1990s.
I'll interject here. I agree with both the points of view of Frans and Peter. From our observation, our doping control program at the Athletics Integrity Unit focuses on the elite athletes in the sport of athletics. Our big challenge and what we see is that the elite level sophisticated dopers are still very, very difficult to catch. We have observed real progress in, thanks to the technology like the ABP, changes in behaviour, but elite level sophisticated dopers use countermeasures to avoid detection. And these athletes take substances that have a small window of detection in very small doses. They manipulate the whereabouts system. They manipulate the indirect methods of detection like the ABP so it doesn't disturb the model. That's how you have a situation under our current state of the science where, as Frans said, there are people doping for many, many years, being tested a lot, but they're not being caught. The problem is that testing agencies aren't running effective testing programs given the science is the bottom line. The testing programs are generally too random, they're not specific, they're not tailored enough. There's not enough effort being put in my opinion, to having testing programs that are making the best use of intelligence, making the best use of science and information to create testing programs which are highly specific and highly individualized.
Peter, to this point, we've talked about being both consistent and inconsistent. Can you explain, please?
Well, I think one of the things you need to do is that you need to be unpredictable in your testing. And if athletes feel comfortable that they figured out your testing scheme, of course they're not going to test positive. And there are a few loopholes which they have. Loopholes like being able to have 2 missed whereabouts, 2 missed tests. And so some of them are using that. If they know they're going to test positive, they simply don't open the door. On the other hand, we need to take into account that for every countermeasure we would take, that an innocent athlete who made an administrative error will be also collateral damage of a change we're making. So it's a thin line, but we need to work on that. We need to work on the fact, looking at Operation Aderlas, that the blood passport looks at longitudinal data, stability of data of your blood values. And if you do a transfusion, you will have changes in your blood. But then you need to collect the sample at the right time. And in Operation Aderlas, they were infusing themselves in a period 2 hours before the competition and then taking the blood out again within 2 hours after the competition. And of course, if you only go to test 3 hours before competition and you only test 3 hours after competition, their blood values are going to be stable. Having said that, we all know that if you're going to test an athlete within 2 hours before competition, that athlete deserves, the clean athlete deserves to be in the zone, getting ready for their performance, and you're going to disrupt that. But what I would really suggest that at least if you go to competitions, have athletes chaperoned also for blood control immediately after the competition. So you have the blood value, even although they need to stay there for 2 hours, because you want to have that difference, and test them often. Be predictable for some period. Go for 6 months, every first Monday of the month, of course to a suspicious athlete, and then hit them on the third Thursday after 6 months, because they will think that they figured you out. Make sure that they think they figured you out and then hit them with something very unpredictable.
Franz?
In Seefeld, the athletes got the blood bags 1 hour before the start. And they gave it out half hour after the race. So you will never find the blood doper in this system. And the doctor knows this. The doctor said to me the system is calculable for him. It's
Calculable,
easy.
yes, it's a hard word.
Not any athlete from the German doctor was tested positive from 2011 up to 2019.
Yeah, you deal with this all the time,
one
Brad.
fact I want to say, I interviewed the doctor many times in Germany at the state prosecutor office, and I asked him, how did you bring the blood to South Korea during the Olympic Winter Games? He said it was quite easy. I filled it in the athletes. I gave them 1 liter before the flight. Then they go 1 hour, 10 hours in the plane. In South Korea, I had a man. They gave out the blood, the 1 liter, and we worked with this blood over the 3 weeks during the Olympic Winter Games.
Brett?
In terms of the response of a testing agency to these kind of tactics, I think the key is that testing agencies into the future have to put more and more resources into intelligence collection, into test planning, and less into just the numbers game of more and more tests. So there are ways to counter these things. For example, immediately take an in-competition test after an event where someone is chaperoned immediately after they get off the bike or off the track for the 3 hours or 2 hours required to take another blood test. That's something we do. But these methodologies can only be developed with a real focus and the resources to creating individual testing plans where you have the sport science combining with the performance data, testing data, combining with the Intel team, day to day looking at what's going on, and then having extremely highly actionable intelligence and an operational setup that can respond very quickly to testing at a moment's notice. You want to test to the day and even to the hour then that you need to put the test on. So that I think is, that's our vision for the future we want to get to in our program.
You've talked about methodologies and resource. How has the AIU shifted its resource from when you started to trying to focus more specifically and in a targeted way on doing exactly what you're talking about?
So we initially we took over the IAAF anti-doping program. Their system was 3/4 of their anti-doping budget was spent on testing itself. We've essentially inverted that now. 1/3 of our anti-doping budget is testing, and the rest goes into investigations, intelligence, and other factors that go into the system. We operate currently under a budget of $8 million US per year, plus next year we've got an additional $3 million that's coming in from the professional road running industry to put up an additional pool of 300 professional road running athletes as well.
Let me ask one more obvious question, and I promise the three of you, including Christine, that I haven't ignored you. The AIU seems like such an obvious manifestation. Why do you think other IFs haven't come to this same realization? Why is the World Athletics, nay, the IAAF, the only institution that has done this so far?
I don't know. I think, I think there are a lot of great testing agencies and anti-doping organisations out there. There are some, I think, that haven't come to grips and are stuck in the past with sending out a whole bunch of tests, and it's probably comfortable not really catching elite level athletes. Our program really focuses on the elite. We catch Olympic and World Championship medalists, world record holders, major marathon winners. In fact, 1/3 of all of our cases in the last 2 years have been Olympic or World Championship medalists. So athletics kind of gets criticised for having a lot of doping, which it does, unfortunately. But we're doing something about it.
Arlie, I'm going to switch to you. In your experience, what has it been like operating under the rules and regulations of the World Anti-Doping Code? For you, personally, as an athlete, you heard Menashe and her experience. For you, what has it been like?
Well, for me, it has been, I have already tested because I have been in 3 different Paralympics, in Vancouver 2010, Sochi 2014, Pyeongchang 2018. And I have always get these tests when I'm getting to these main events. But I have had like really few tests in Mexico. So that's why I'm going through the same thing. I think the resource is really important also to apply it in countries that they are not so developed yet, because they are not putting so much effort in order to kind of catch the athletes that they are doing. They are tricking or enhancing their performance with drugs. So I cannot say, like, comparing with my friends that they are in the US and they are like kind of surveyed by USADA, they can have any kind of test anytime. And also we could have it in Mexico, but the reality is that they don't invest so much money into getting this test to all the athletes. And I think this is the case not just for Mexico, but for the countries that they are not so developed, that it kind of the same thing. So with this problem, I think what you face is that they could kind of program their doping, because if you know that at the end you will be just tested mainly in the big events, you can maybe do some things before and then just be ready whenever you are sure that you will have that test going on.
I see the two of you shaking your heads in affirmation. Has that been your experience as well, especially in developing nations?
Yeah, well, it depends on the nation we're talking.
Obviously, it depends on the place.
Out, but yeah, if testing systems are too predictable, and there's a real incentive to dope, the sad reality is that a big portion of people will dope. And what we owe to the clean athletes is to have it's easy to say, speak up, play true, but if we're not effective at actually catching the ones who are cheating, we're letting them down.
Arlie, back to you. We've talked before about a special situation in your country, about things that you're worried about, in particular about clenbuterol in particular. How do you deal with something like that? How do you, if you go to the restaurant and have a meal, how do you know that a simple hamburger or a steak isn't going to get you busted when you're trying to have dinner?
Well, the reality is that there's no way that you can know. Even, for example, in Mexico, have happened that even the athletes that they are just taking the food from the Olympic Committee and Paralympic Committee, they happen to get positive on the test because even like it's very sad, but the reality is that in our country, with corruption, you can get a certification that your meat it's a proper out of any hormones or whatever or substances. But the reality is that you don't have you are not completely sure about it, and that's the case that it can happen. If it happens in the Olympic Committee, it can happen anywhere. So it's a very hard, and I think we should together unified in getting ways as scientists and everything in order to test, to be very effective in the way to test the food that the athletes are taking. Because, I mean, for me, it's been that my solution has been that I get a lot more into vegan food rather than meat. But I know that not all the people are willing to do that. So that's what I do.
It is an issue in some countries with clenbuterol, and so now we've got this letter from WADA which partially deals with it. I mean, there's been a new, let's call it threshold. It's not an official threshold, but at least a reporting limit, and then case management needs to take over. And yes, this is somewhere where science has been short. You know, we haven't been able to figure out how we can distinguish between voluntary use of clenbuterol as a doping agent and use as a food contaminant. And there have been quite some efforts looking at even the molecule itself and how it was, the distribution of the molecule. Fact is that this is probably something which we are never going to be able to solve. Being able to distinguish if an athlete took something inadvertently or willingly. I think the only solution there would be a lie detector test, but we all know what Lance Armstrong did with the lie detector. So we're not going to solve that. It is, we can see if a substance is present, what the concentration is, but whether or not it was willing or unwilling, I think that's results management, that's interviews with the athletes, that's looking at the risks, which region was the athlete in, what is the prevalence of that doping agent there in food supplements. But from a scientific point of view, I'm actually somebody who's normally always optimistic, but in this case I'm quite pessimistic. We're not going to solve that. We're going to solve a whole lot of more things in the near future. I mean, I'm not afraid for gene doping. As you've heard, methods are being validated, are being implemented, so the future's bright on that side. But some things, when it comes down to the psyche of the athlete, we as chemists will not be able to solve that. And so with the food problem, you're stuck. It's up to the individual countries to clean up their food production. In Europe, there was an issue in the 1980s. It's been cleaned up completely. So I'm looking at those governments do the same thing as Europe did in the 1980s. Be hard on those people who use those substances in the cattle fattening industry. Be very hard on them and control your meat, your food production, like athletes are being controlled.
And maybe in this case, it would be a solution. It's education, but not just for the athletes, but also for the governments and the people who are in charge. And I think this is something that we have to bring this awareness to countries. And for example, I speak up for Mexico. I would love this information to come and be kind of a pressure into governments to actually do this acts in order for us, but because this is not a thing that it will just benefit the athletes, but also the general population. So I would really push that. I think it's a really great
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm always optimistic,
I can see.
but I was listening to like the scientific side of, and also investigative side of anti-doping program itself. I think anti-doping community tends to be, or clean sport community tends to be talking about detection, deterrence, and also enforcement. And now that ISC has opportunity to make sure that education itself has good and will give the good angle to the anti-doping program itself. So on the point of like Clenbuterol, for example, I was listening to very passionately about 19 years old Zimbabwean athlete. She's there. I do really hope, like, when this session is about future vision, you know, where do we see where we are in the future? And in this session, I was thinking, what's the future mean? And I mean that the future is the next revision of the code, which will be possibly 2025 or 2026.
Wait, you're stealing my question.
Sorry, I'm not stealing the question. But I do hope with the fact that now the education, international standard for education coming in place, and we're not going to be talking about in 2025 that education should be the first priority. Education should come for any athletes as a first experience of anti-doping. And in 2025, I hope that we can say that for sure. And that's the minimum part. And also on the point of inadvertent doping, including the Clenbuterol part. Why, like somebody like her, like 19 years old, come up to one of the major international events, and at the event, it is her first time getting the education. And there's something wrong with it. So by 2025, code revision coming into place, I do hope that every one of us can say that the athletes who are turning up to the international events, major international events, have taken education, minimum level information given to ensure they're confident in the event.
So there's an interplay here between what you're talking about and what Christine has mentioned. Christine, you said when we were talking to each other in the lead up to this event, you said, I think these words are beautiful, we seem to be fighting an unending war with limited resources, funding, and administrative capabilities. I think that could not be more true. Talk to everyone about, or tell everyone your perspective about this very thing and how we go forward given that reality.
All right, thanks, Alan. So I'll start off by saying that while standards are very important, it is very difficult to achieve equality. We work in regions of the world that have very many competing priorities, and often anti-doping is not a priority. I think one of the biggest challenges we have with the RADO program is public authorities and government commitment to anti-doping. So a country will work very hard to prepare their teams to participate in this event, but anti-doping is often not in the budget. So we are hoping that through such forums where we have such a good representation of public authorities, that they can take it back home, that anti-doping is a critical element of the athlete preparations. I agree with you that it is quite unfortunate that an international level athlete is coming to learn about anti-doping for the first time in an international event and at the WADA booth. So I would also like to say that the RADO program has been able to achieve something important, which is providing a mechanism through which there are viable anti-doping programs in regions of the world that would have otherwise not had programs because of political instability, resource constraints. We've also been able to increase the global testing figures. And not only that, continue promoting the long-term sustainability of this testing and anti-doping education. And on this point, I'm talking about availability of the panels, that's the TUECs, the results management panels. We have blood collection officers, we have doping control officers, we have anti-doping educators available in these countries. So there's been progress on that area. So further to that, we've been working a lot with the stakeholders present here. More and more we are seeing sporting organizations working with the RADO programs to ensure that the regional and international events are getting testing and anti-doping education. We are working with the international federations as they go about their work in testing, investigations, results management. We are working a lot also with the public authorities. And at this point, I think I want to mention the importance of the UNESCO fund, through which many of the RADO countries have implemented very successful anti-doping projects in capacity building, in anti-doping education. So the RADO program is coming to fruition, but we really want to appeal to the public authorities to reaffirm their commitment and their support for anti-doping programs.
Public authorities, appeal noted. Brett, you work in many of these same countries that Christine has been talking about. What is the interplay between what you are doing and what her institutions are doing?
Yeah, so the interplay between the issues she's facing and the elite end of the sport are very are real and very important. In East Africa in particular, there is a huge group of professional runners. This huge group of professional runners can earn great money all around the world because they're so good at the long distance events. And if there's not enough testing on that big group, we're talking hundreds, thousands of people, the NADOs and the RADOs in that region don't have enough resources to test deep into that group, and these people are earning lots and lots of money. So it creates a huge risk for doping, it creates black market for doping substances, to the degree that, you know, there's, in those regions, there's not necessarily people behind the scenes or a central doping scheme or a Mr. Big controlling everything. It becomes like a part of the drug trade, and people know how to use prohibited substances for as part of their profession. So we work really closely with the RADOs and the NADOs in that region. We're rolling out a big program that'll be funded by the professional road running industry, the racers themselves, the athletes themselves and the managers, to increase the testing pool a great deal there. So the first step on that is education. We're going to have a whole bunch of new athletes who will be brought into a testing pool next year, and it's a really interesting exercise in the importance of for us to try and do education there, just as something we're going to do, would be stupid and wouldn't work. So we really rely on the support of the local athletics federations and the local NADOs to actually bring it to life and make it work.
This word comes up over and over again, and that word is education. Yaya, we can say with confidence that there are perhaps 10,000 DCOs in the world. And yet, if I were to ask you right now how many educators there are in the anti-doping sphere, could we say with confidence how many there are?
I don't have a figure to it.
Or can we even guess? We don't have a number. It's an aphorism, but this is true. Unless you know the number, you can't measure. Without measuring the metric, you can't judge results. I mean, this seems like a basic.
Well, I don't have a research-based number to it as an educator. As you realize that now educator term itself is defined in International Standard for Education. But every one of us in this room can be an educator. You've been exposed to a number of information on updating anti-doping, program areas. Whether or not you do educate among ourselves is another question. And I always feel, coming back to Christine's point, that down the line, I think that there should be a structured anti-doping program itself to anti-doping organizations. Sometimes I do have opportunity to work with a number of NADOs and RADOs in Asian regions, and they are one-person operations sometimes, or one person needs to do a lot of things which are necessary to do in relation to the code. However, I'm very worried that anti-doping organization staff themselves are educated enough. So I think that itself needs to be solved, and I do hope that we can say that there are educator groups educators that we know the number, how many numbers there are as an educator, and there's a structured approach to be educated, to be an educator down the line in the future.
Peter?
Don't get me wrong, I'm a huge fan of education. And I think it's important that athletes know what is prohibited, what the effects might be, and that they know about the moral values behind it. But I do believe also that education really has its limits. And I'm looking at the people in this audience where I'm saying, who in the audience doesn't know that smoking harms your health? I think everybody's been educated by this, and then who of you knows somebody who knows that smoking harms your health but is still smoking every day? Probably some of the people in the audience are smoking it on a daily basis. So education will change some aspects, and at least it can prevent some of the collateral damage, which I always regret. People who are testing inadvertently positive because they used a product where they had no idea even that it was prohibited. So they didn't have the wrong intention. Nevertheless, it's prohibited and it should be sanctioned. But education has its limitations, and I really think that we need a much stronger testing program, a much stronger, meaning not only more intelligent, but I also mean much more samples. I always find it shocking to realize that in the horse racing industry, 3 times more samples are being collected on a yearly basis than in human sports. Total human sports collects less than 1/3 of horse racing. I think that is shameful. I'm not saying that in the horse racing they don't do a proper job, but I think it's shameful. If you're looking at the newspapers, at least in Belgium, about half of the newspaper is filled with sports. And apparently we cannot raise enough awareness and enough funds from all organizations associated with sports, whether it be federations, whether it be governments, whether it be sponsors, that they don't want to have clean sports. I think this is unbelievable. Something's really wrong, and I think maybe some aspect of education should be on that, pointing fingers at every partner in sports that they're not doing enough.
Christine, you have made the point eloquently in your notes to me in preparation that more governments need to come to the table. I have written this time and again. What is the magic bullet? How do we as a community make this happen?
Thank you, Alan. So I think the debate is policies are being made every day, and these policies have an impact on the quality and how we implement our programs. I would like also just to say, apart from government, it's a challenge for all of the stakeholders here. During the process of code drafting, code editing, and the international standards revision, to consider the impact of the policies that are being made on the over 130 countries which are under the RADO program, because some of these revisions have huge repercussions. I'll give you an example that it's now compulsory, it's mandatory to collect blood samples. So in preparations for the World Athletics Championships in Doha, we had to collect blood samples from these countries. I'll give you an example of a neighboring country, which is Uganda. We had to collect blood samples. Athletes don't train in the cities. They train in the high altitude areas, which are way in the village. Access to that athlete is almost impossible. It's an 8-hour road trip to get to that athlete on bad roads. The sample has to get to the lab within 36, and if you're lucky, 72 hours. It's almost an impossible logistical nightmare, but it's now compulsory. So there are such challenges in implementation, and our appeal, and why we're even asking more public authorities to come to the table, they have to make these policies happen. They have to give us the facilitation to make these changes happen.
Brett?
Yeah, Christine's story there is exactly the experience we have in the region. One thing I'll say, I mean, from a sport perspective, I'm kind of, I guess, sick of saying we've got to get the public authorities, we've got to go to the public authorities. Like the sports have to actually do stuff themselves as well. So in the case of the blood samples in East Africa, we have many great Ugandan athletes and obviously many great Kenyans and Ethiopians. We were having real trouble getting the blood samples out to be tested within 36 hours. So we funded the Nairobi Blood Laboratory and put it there ourselves with our own money. We said we have to get this done, cost us $250,000 US ourselves, and we just did it. We sort of got sick of waiting for the governments and everyone to get a whole bunch of people to get together and do it, so we just did it. So these challenges exist, and obviously as many partnerships and cooperations you can build as possible is great, but sports shouldn't use that to sidestep responsibility for their own competition. We did that because it was important to athletics.
Arlie, I don't think that social media is the end-all be-all. I mean, I teach it in my journalism courses, but I do think it has a significant and important role to play in this discussion of how the clean sport movement goes forward. You use social media effectively and significantly. What's your take on how social media can contribute to all of this?
I think as social media is a super powerful tool nowadays. I think it's super important in actually just a normal career for an athlete in order to become someone interesting to build relationships within companies and athletes in order to not just amplify the really powerful story of an athlete, but also to link it together with the good values of a company that may have. But the reality, I think, at least in this way, is that through social media, you get really, really close to an athlete's lives, and not just that, but also their values and also the habits that they have. So for me, to empower social media, it's a tool that you can really build role models that they are actually sharing to the new coming generations, because the coming generations, they are not watching so much TV anymore. They are a lot in these devices, and they follow they are fans of athletes, and they follow their lives through this. So I think that more than just being a tool, I think it's important to use it and to embrace the athletes, to be role models, to share good values, good practices, and hopefully this will be a tool that will encourage new generations to come and to replicate a little bit of what they are seeing that their idols are doing in their everyday life.
One of the things that Munashi raised and that we've spoken of today is that her first experience with any of this was when she showed up in Buenos Aires. Why Yaya in particular, why do you think there's such a disconnect between an athlete's daily life in what I would call middle school or junior high school and high school or elite competitive sport, and then getting to a place like the Youth Olympic Games and then encountering the WADA rules or the WADA system for the first time? Why is that?
If you ask me like why that is the reasons, there are multiple reasons to it, I guess. But sometimes that reason tends to be kind of excuse like not to be able to train the proper educators or not to be able to finance to the education program. Any country does have education policy, and why there's a disconnection in between is because maybe one of the reasons could be different ministerial departments funds in different sections of sport. So I guess, like down the line in the future, with ISC coming into place, that there are more joint effort to make sure that all the athletes' experiences in clean sport can be more structured and funding in a way that athletes would never turn up to the national events or international events where testing is taking place, and they would get minimum level of information. But I think I'm more hopeful, and I'm sorry, I'm very provocative, but I do oppose with what he said about education does have a limitation. Education should be the future forward. If we say education itself, if we doubt about the values of education, power of education, there won't be any kind of value society in the future, I should think. And I think with ISE and by working with multiple of stakeholders, it is an opportunity to more collaboratively working together. It happens, I think, here and there. No, it's not structured approach as yet. So I hope that kind of these connections in between these multiple stakeholders would be get solved, I hope, and then there are more investment for the future, and education is an investment for the future.
So we have a few minutes left. I'd like to wrap up with two sort of blue sky questions for everybody. Number one, as somebody who makes his living using words, I find it problematic that this movement rests on two negatives. One is anti and the second is doping. How does this, is there a change that's possible so that instead of this being a no and a no, this is changed into a yes? Is that possible? Anyone? Is it possible that this becomes a clean sport movement rather than an anti-doping movement? What sort of language change would that need to happen?
I think the words fair play, it's something that it has to be used way more than, as you said, I'm also very positive in my life in general, and I think anti-doping, it sounds very, very strong. I mean, it's a strong situation that we are dealing with, but it has to come to fair play and to actually promote, empower people. I would also say that, because it's matter of to raise the power of every single human, but in an equal opportunity. And I think that's what we come to life, just to really raise our standards and I think that I love to say, redefine what is possible, or redefine what is impossible, right? And I think that just through our example and through us pushing our own selves, I think it's a very powerful tool in order to show what is possible and acting actually in a very clean way, in a very fair play, and that if I do it in a fair way, anyone can do it. And it's kind of to promote this within all human race.
Beautiful. Anybody else?
Yeah, Alan, thanks for that. I always say that anti-doping itself captures perception-wise as well. And Thomas Bach said perception is a reality, perception becomes reality, and I truly believe in it too. Anti-doping itself kind of captures quite double negative. And down the line, 20 years' time, that when we look back, the foundational WADA, 2020, when is it in 20 years' time? We can say that we have shifted our languages. In the previous panel, there was some talk about the fight, the battle. These are quite hard term to use. The battle is used in the war, for example. And I think we should be shifted away from it. And there are a number of anti-doping organizations that I know have created, the values message and a powerful message in sport. And at the end of the day, what we want is the passionate to sport. My 3-year-old, by watching the World Rugby, he is really passionate about rugby just because it's fun. And it's fun to watch, it's fun to be engaged, and it's really fantastic to see the inherent kind of passion coming out from this young one. So we hope that we can shift away from kind of double negative term, and we can capture a more powerful word in sport.
My comment is, I don't think it's a competition between education and the promotion of values and the negative of enforcement and detection. Both rely on one another to be successful, in my opinion. Unfortunately, doping is a crime type, effectively, and there are always people engaged in the terrible calculus of what are my chances of getting caught, what's the benefit to me. That's going to happen, and what we owe on the side that Franz works in, Peter works in, is the capacity, the capability to actually be effective. And that allows the positive message to also play its part, because without, if you don't have that group down to an irreducible minimum, because you have good values in the rest of the community, it makes the job of detection impossible when people aren't willing to speak up, call out bad behaviour, etc. So I think it's the two complementary parts of the system that must both be enhanced into the future.
So before I get to the second blue sky question, a really practical question. We talk over and over again about resources and funding. Christine, I asked you this question point blank when we were getting ready. I'll ask you if you have an idea. What sorts of monies would it take? We've heard the WADA budget is under $40 million. Virtually every college in the United States has a football budget that's way more than that. If the annual anti-doping or clean sport budget is in the area of $250, $300 million American, that's still not very much money. How much money would, should, could it take to make a real difference? Anybody, everybody. If you went to the governments of the world and said, this is how much money it's going to take, how much money is that? Again, if we need metrics, how much is it? Yeah. Go ahead, Peter.
I have no idea exactly what number you would like, but I think it could be quite symbolic. If every federation, if every government would spend 1% of its budget, which it spends on sports, including building of sports infrastructure, sports capacity, on fair play, I'm not going to use the negative word, on fair play, I think we would be a long way. 1%, not more, 1% of everything, including then sports organizations, sponsors. If everybody could chip in 1%, that's not a lot. I think we would be a long way.
Well, I'll take as much as they're willing to give, but I'll go beyond that and say that beyond the money, I think it's a question of commitment. From my region of the world, it remains an issue of commitment. If the people and the stakeholders give commitment, then the resources that we are discussing to be in shortage will be available, from administrative capacities, technology that will help us with our work. So it's an issue of commitment from my end. I would also like to say that there's a huge opportunity in partnerships. We have many success stories of NADOs working with RADOs, or the developing NADOs. And here we are looking at partnerships that are being built on sharing of experiences and expertise. So it's not just a question of money. A lot more can be done.
Okay, final blue sky question. We are here. Oh, Franz, excuse me.
I can say it in money, how much is needed, but I can say it in, how can I say it? In my unit, 7 officers are at the moment, and I have cases for 30 officers. So you can imagine how much work we have to do.
I think that's a fairly dramatic representation of what needs to be done. Thank you. Okay, final blue sky question. We are all gathered here today 20 years into the development of WADA. Let's pretend we are now 20 years into the future. What does this conference look like? What do the rules look like? What does the clean sport movement look like? What, in your ideal world, what progress has been made? Anyone, everyone? Do you have 30 officers being funded, Franz? Or do you need 30 officers anymore?
I think 30 officers in my office are needed. For doping cases, match fixing cases, and some other. But I think the system is not good enough to go against doping networks behind the athletes. In my opinion, police is needed. A doping controller can't go against a doping network. A doping controller can make doping controls on athletes, but cannot go against the system behind. We're talking about definitely organized crime. And we have the possibility from police side for surveillance, wiretapings, and so on and so on. During the World Championship in Seefeld, Nordic World Championship in Seefeld, we had 80 officers to go against this network.
And I mean, in 20 years, I would love to see fair play way more attractive, you know? That maybe a lot of, I would say myself, I feel as an ambassador, and I would love to amplify more and more the message and the values from the WADA, from IOC, from IPC. But I think we need a whole army of athletes, top-level athletes, that they are also sharing this message and bringing it to more and more people and to all the people that are looking up to them. And I think in 20 years, with a lot more of technology and a lot more of science and intelligence and all the people around WADA working really hard, hopefully won't need 30 officers, but because the technology would be way more efficient. But at the same time, I would say that we need to really put a lot of effort into sharing the message of fair play.
Yeah, at minimum, in 20 years' time, I hope that we can say that inadvertent doping itself is reduced. So the research, some research suggests that 40 to 60% of AIF is inadvertent. So that number itself needs to be reduced, and we can say that in 20 years' time, that's for sure. That's kind of determinations that we need to go forward. And on the point of him saying about the values message and a powerful message, I do hope like some of the educators, athletes can be educated to be an educator as well. So we can see the whole, I should say, global network educator itself, and we know the number to it in 20 years' time, and how many athletes are educated to be an educator itself as well. So that's something I want to see in 20 years' time.
All right, I would say that I agree with all of you. And my desire is that in 20 years' time, the system or our programs will be strong. And this is based on the fact that the system is as strong as its weakest link. So we hope that there will be programs that are to the same level. And I think I need to say that there's a huge opportunity here through the WADA monitoring program, because it has provided an opportunity for most of the countries with weaker programs to gauge the level at which they are implementing their programs, and an opportunity for them to correct their programs to raise them up to code standards. So there's a huge opportunity in that. We pray that the WADA program development department gets more resources to continue with the good job they're doing. They continue supporting the RADO countries in a lot of our activities, from providing testing grants, salary grants to keep full-time employees in office. So there's a huge opportunity for us there. So at 20 years down the line, our systems are actually effective and efficient.
Christine, thank you.
I guess the main part of my vision has to do with the values of sport. I don't think we can separate the question of anti-doping and athlete values from the values of sport in a broader context, and the values and ethics with which administrators are acting in sport governance. My unit oversees not just anti-doping but also anti-corruption in athletics, and it's almost an impossible ask to ask athletes to act with ethics if the administrators are ripping everyone off or whatever they're doing. So when I kind of think of the blue sky, we've really made a lot of progress on sport governance in general and the values that go along with that.
Peter, you get the last word.
It's very difficult to say where science will be in 20 years. It's difficult to say where science will be in 5 years. So I'm going to have a shot at 5 years and looking at the anti-doping facts then. The list is expanding at an incredible rate. And that means that we will need more and more indirect methods, passport programs. On top of that, the science from the anti-doping field is expanding so fast, or going so fast, that multiple more substances we will be able to detect for more than several months. So we can do this now for already quite a few substances. So that will relieve to some way the testing program. Having said that, whenever we take a step forward, the athletes know about it and they make a next step. So there will be new loopholes which we will need to close. I'm looking very optimistic also into the microsampling technology, not as President Bach has suggested to replace urine testing, but to complement urine testing and to provide answers on effectiveness at the time of competition, so we can get rid of some side effects of a cannabis smoke or a cocaine use 2-3 days before, or perhaps even a clenbuterol case due to eating contaminated meat. So I'm looking forward to that. And I think in 20 years' time, if you invite me again, I will see if I was wrong even about the 5 years. But science is progressing very, very fast. But as said by Christine, even if the labs perform at their best, and I truly believe that we have the best quality routine labs in any scientific field around the world, the system is only as strong as the weakest link in the chain. And if you go to an athlete and control that athlete not at the right time, whatever lab does, the test is going to fail, and even that will not have changed in 20 years.
I'd like to see cheaper costs as well, if you can do something for us about that, Peter. Any comment on that?
Reducing the cost, that's very difficult. I'm completely honest. Currently, the prices for labs are incredibly low. I have colleagues which do toxicology in my same department. They have far less substances they need to look for at gigantic concentrations, because one of them is a forensic toxicologist. So if it gets to his lab, the patient has died. And they're asking 7 times the price from an anti-doping lab. It is extremely low. You need to consider that in my lab alone, the infrastructure, I mean these instruments by itself, and we're a medium-sized lab in Belgium, it costs 5 million euros. And we can do about 5 years with that. So that's 1 million euros per year, just instrument cost. And if you calculate how much an instrument costs in maintenance, you need to double that. So 2 million euros per year I need to earn just to pay for the instrument. And with that instrumentation, I can do about roughly 10,000 to 20,000 samples.
Perhaps it's the collection costs we can work on.
The collection cost and also the transport cost. I sometimes see samples getting into my lab, one sample being collected, 500 kilometers away. It's a blood sample, and it cost 800 euros to get the blood sample into my lab. And then the ADO is asking me for a price reduction for the blood analysis, which is 40 euros.
Will the blood spot technology help with that? Sorry to take over.
The blood spot technology will complement routine testing. It will be an additional cost, but it will provide additional answers. So don't expect that the dried blood spots or microsampling, because it's not only dried blood spot, but that the microsampling technologies will reduce costs. I'm sorry, if that is the message which has been transferred to you, I'm sorry, it will be a complementary cost, but it will, for analysis, but it will give you some extra answers and perhaps lead to less costs in results management afterwards. So I think it's a wise investment.
So as you can see from our last back and forth, we promised ourselves in rehearsal yesterday that we would try to be interesting and interactive. I think we were. We'd like to thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your time. That's the end of session 3. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, panelists. I have a bad news and a good news. The bad news is that we have less time for lunch, but the good news is that it was worth to wait a bit longer because it was really interesting and inspiring session. So thank you, Alan. Once again, thank you, panelists. It was really, really interesting to hear you and hear all your stories from all the aspects of the fighting against doping. So we have 60 minutes for lunch. I think it's enough for each of you to refresh, and we're gonna get back here to listen for the president, Sir Riddy, which will conduct 3 next sessions. So enjoy your lunch, and I think I should say in Polish, because I try to learn Polish. You guys, smacznego, and see you in 1 hour. Please mind the speakers' announcements. We'll announce 5 minutes prior to